Hi again. I wanted to take a few minutes and just hit a few key highlights from your readings in Baum and Shattle that I'm hoping that we're going to highlight and try to bring together alongside the Bible passage reading so that we're able to begin to think about what it means to be a global citizen and a person of faith. So again, I'm just going to call up the slideshow. So, your reading this week in Shattle talks about three key criteria that help flesh out our understanding of citizenship. And these are this idea of rights and duties of citizens, about democratic empowerment and participation in civic life, and this idea of allegiance, belonging, identity, and loyalty. So, rights and duties. First of all, this idea that these are claims by individuals, these beliefs around um, basic rights and responsibilities that individuals have on their community. Human rights, however, are seen ideally to cut across this conversation. They include civil and political rights, so freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to vote, and so on, as well as social and religious rights, so access to education, healthcare, living wage, safe workplaces, and so on. And you'll note that right off the bat, these are things that we hold dear and that we believe in. We also know that they don't universally happen even in Canada. So this idea that they are inalienable, well, we know that that's not true. We can think of indigenous communities that to this day do not have access to clean drinking water or appropriate health care. We can think of the fact that all of these communities listed here have been at some point denied the right to vote in Canada. Again, in the Canadian context, we know that we had slavery. We often like to think that slavery is an American problem. Well, this isn't in fact true. And we know that African Canadians were denied the right to vote until 1864. And at that point, only men had access to vote, but even then experienced significant discrimination. Um, it continues well into the last century. Asian men and women in Canada often were denied the right to vote until 1948, and women were denied the right to vote until the early 1900s. And in fact, in 1940, it was only then that women were allowed the right to vote, and there were only minor exceptions for women who owned land prior to 1920. And in Indigenous communities, even as recently as 1934, Indigenous individuals were disqualified from the right to vote when living on reserves or living in Inuit communities. And it was only until 1950 or 1960 that people who were Indigenous were able to vote, which I think is a sobering reality. We often, I think, look to our neighbors south of us, and we perhaps don't reflect on our own discrimination that has been pretty significant for many marginalized communities. Even today, globally, there are significant situations where we know that groups of people are denied basic human rights, including the right to free movement within their community, the right to vote, and so on. So, one example that you'll have heard about in the news is the Uyghurs, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this is a Turkish ethnic group in Central and East Asia who are a Muslim minority. And since approximately 2015, over 1 million of these individuals have been detained in Chinese re-education camps, and there has been significant allegations of genocide across the international community. So I'm sure that you can also think of significant examples where, both in Canada or globally, we know that there are these groups of people who are being denied these rights of citizenship that we take for granted. The second point is this idea of democratic empowerment and belonging, and the notion that citizenship includes active engagement in the political forum. And one of the things that I'd like you to begin thinking about, both throughout this course, but also for class on Monday, is what does it mean to be actively engaged in civic life? One quote that I look to is this idea of Aristotle, or this idea Aristotle proposed. And that is, he noted that one citizen differs from another, but it is the salvation of the community that is common to us all. And so, this idea that while we are individuals, we do have common goals and a commitment to the common good. One of the things that he proposes is this idea of the salvation of the community. And again, I'd like you to think about that as we head into our discussion groups on Monday. What does it mean to think about the salvation of the community? What is our individual and collective responsibility in terms of supporting and nurturing our salvation? I've referenced it below. Please note that while it is a Barnes reference, that's simply the editor and translator of the complete works of Aristotle. And then finally, Shattle talks about this idea of allegiance and belonging and loyalty and identity that is associated with citizenship. So, this idea of a psychological attachment to our political and geographic communities. However, it is noted that among communities, there are overriding identities and attachments that people may identify with that are not allied to political or geographic communities. And so think about examples of that. Perhaps you might want to discuss that in your breakout groups. And of course, there's the underlying concern that Shattle notes about this emerging nationalism that we see both in Canada and certainly in the United States that holds anti-immigration views, where outsiders to the country, immigration, is seen as a potential threat. So think about why, how these attitudes exist, and what do they mean in terms of our overall conversation around citizenship. One of the definitions of globalization that Shattle proposes that I quite like is this idea of a reconfiguration of social geography with this increased emphasis on planetary connections between people. So again, I'm highlighting these points from your reading that I'm hoping that you will reflect on and bring into your conversation in the breakout groups on Monday. And I wanted to introduce them now because I don't want to spend time in our time together unpacking this or walking through this. I'm hoping you'll have read this, watched this video, and then begin thinking about these ideas so that we arrive on Monday and we can immediately go into some conversations. And then moving on to Gregory Baum. So Gregory Baum is the author of the short book Compassion and Solidarity we'll be reading together this semester. Mr. Gregory Baum is a Canadian Roman Catholic priest who died in 2017. He was a social ethicist. He was very committed to liberal and social agendas. In particular, this idea of the preferential option for the poor and the oppressed, which we'll see next week, is an idea that really, really emerges when we read the Sermon on the Mount. And he was also really committed to this idea of interfaith dialogue and pluralism. So, and we need to remember, as comes out in your first chapter of Baum, this is a pretty radical idea. This belief that the Catholic Church didn't have all the answers, and that in fact other people and other faiths had equally important contributions to this conversation of faith and God, and that dialogue was a really valuable and important part of a journey of faith. And I realize that for many of us sitting in this classroom, we go, but it's important to remember that this was a pretty significant and radical idea back in the middle of the last century. So this was pretty significant in terms of his writings and his work. So he talks about in his work and what we're going to read in Compassion and Solidarity, he really discusses issues like religious pluralism, solidarity with the poor and the oppressed, and the fact that God's work is evident through all people, not only religious people, but people who do not embrace faith, people who are secular. And he also introduces this idea of liberation theology, which is something that is going to be important again as we unpack some of the themes this semester. Liberation theology is a theology that sides with the poor and the oppressed. It emerged primarily in Latin America among deeply oppressed and victimized communities. And it embraces this idea that while Jesus was not a political figure, his message of identifying with people who are poor and oppressed has profound political impact. And that social transformation and ultimately justice begins with this vulnerable and oppressed and poor community when they are empowered to engage in self advocacy and solidarity. And that they, through these practices, address the injustice and promote a common good that values the dignity, respect, and full sort of thriving of all people. So I'm hoping that you'll have read these chapters and that you'll bring these ideas with you to class on Monday so that we can begin to work through them in our breakout groups. I'll see you then, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.